a keynote address by Professor Walter Lorenz. Professor Lorenz is very familiar scholar. Professor Lorenz was a professor of social work at University College Cork in Ireland, and at the Free University Bolzano, Italy, where he served also a 4-year term as a rector. So he is also into educational administration as well. He's currently the contract professor at Bozen and Charles University of Prague. A native of Germany, he qualified as a social worker at the London School of Economics and practiced this profession for 8 years in East London. His research interests cover anti-racism practice and current historical aspects of European social work. And he was awarded honorary doctorates from universities in Kent and Aalborg. Very happy to have Professor Lorenz for this very interesting talk, which you're going to have deliver for this August audience. Thank you so much for taking this effort to come online for this conference. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you very much indeed for the invitation to have the opportunity to share with all the friends and colleagues worldwide our reflections on the current situation from a social work perspective. And I'm very happy that this conference is taking place despite all the difficulties. And I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers, not just for having made the original plans, but also for being so creative in allowing us to meet, at least virtually, in this format this year. So thank you very much to all of you. But I think the format of the conference, virtually and online, also brings home to us what we are missing by not being able to be really close to each other, by not having social contacts. And I think that is symbolic and is something that we as social workers have to reflect on very specifically. So just to look from my perspective, but following on from the introduction by Professor Su, some of the effects that this corona crisis is having is indeed that it exposes the weaknesses and the cleavages in our social fabric that are not caused just by the crisis, but that have been working for a long time to make us so vulnerable to this crisis. What we are experiencing is that the demands on services have increased considerably for particularly what is called the frontline workers and have made work more complicated. It has highlighted also that we have to put emphasis on mental health problems and shown vulnerability of people, not just on the physical medical side, on the economic side, but also on the mental health side. It has increased demands on all of us that show what makes our life really social. When we cannot socialize in the usual sense, that we cannot hug people, that we cannot have physical contact, and particularly in situations like the elderly people or dying people, this has a very dramatic effect on our social living together, and social networks are no substitute for that. For me, this key motto of having to keep social distance is absolutely devastating, because it shows also that our society has for a long time been drifting towards a state of social distancing. And this is being highlighted even more now. It also shows the tension that is growing between our concerns for better care, immediate personal care, but also it evidences the polarization between care and control. And as you all know, this is a central issue for social work. So the overall effect for me is that the corona crisis exposes the weakening of our social cohesion, and therefore it threatens to leave us badly defended and badly prepared for the future bringing together of society again. Just to remind us that what we appreciate in terms of achievements of welfare and of social cohesion owes itself largely to the post-World War II situation, when social commitment in the form of various forms of welfare programs and welfare states were built on the awareness that welfare, dignity, and autonomy became a priority because of the attacks on basic human values and dignity in Nazism, fascism, and indeed the whole savagery of war. We had therefore a strong emphasis in the communist East on the social needs that have become there in all the criticism that has been made of that, but a central matter of the state, and the well-being of citizens was a declared priority there. But also in the capitalist West, the forms of social needs had to be balanced with pure economic interests in the form of what has been called social market economy. And in that context, in the West, the rise of the social worker encapsulates and incorporates this professionalization of basic welfare and well-being, not just on charity, but of founding social citizenship based on social rights. Because social work represents the realization that social problems are always associated with the question, does the person fully belong to society? Marginalization is what we as social workers are ultimately concerned about, and how to overcome marginalization. The contrasting regimes, the contrasting political systems with marketization in the West and socialism on the East was a polarization that really created an unnecessary contrast, which we again in social work are used to holding together, namely the concern for liberty and the concern for equality. Human beings are incorporated into communities, but there also are free agents who make rational choices. We have to rely on the collective, as we see in the present crisis, but the state must not eliminate the need and the dignity of the individual. And all the social political planning and the market mechanisms have to be brought into some sort of interplay rather than being polarized and split. So helping in the form of social work is always the attempt to integrate this political polarity, this context, which always tries to drive a divide between what it means for people to have autonomy and at the same time of having the possibility and the means of achieving equality and living in a society characterized by equality. That means practically we as social workers use relationship and relationship building not as something that is purely instrumental, that to achieve that people change because we have built that relationship, which is probably the point of therapeutic relationship interventions. But for us, relationship itself is the key to facilitating changes. And that requires a particular form of relationship. That requires a form of relationship that acknowledges that in the way we assist people, we represent rights. We represent and actualize people's entitlement to belong to a society. Because modern societies, in contrast to traditional societies, always have to make a special political effort to underline and to facilitate the integration and the cohesion of a society. It requires political and legal entitlements rather than just charity or personal attention to people's problems. So social workers constitute this vital link of people who are pushed to the margins of society, that through our intervention, the link can be established, and not just the link on account of the efforts that the individual makes, but also on account of the efforts that society collectively makes to include and to facilitate full participation in the workings of society. But what we had to witness over last decades, and this has unfortunately a very long history, is the decline of the commitment to welfare. And that in all parts of the world, after the enthusiasm and the orientation that characterized the first decades after the Second World War. We look back to the oil crisis and rising unemployment, which made state budget deficits such a central issue. We had the crisis of the welfare state declared more or less officially in many, many scientific publications and analyses, that the welfare state, because of such high unemployment, could not finance itself in the way it was originally conceived. And therefore, investments in welfare increasingly were seen as a burden, as costs that exceed benefits, and that welfare gradually became to be considered as being too generous rather than as being fundamental. The year 1989 for me represents really a decisive turning point, not just because of the political changes that obviously were most welcome to the people having been under such undignified restrictions through a one-sided collectivism that reigned there. But the end of communism also meant that the competition for minimal social standards that had, I think, influenced the development of welfare on the Western side of that divide, that incentive was no longer operating. And we therefore had free rein for the ideologies of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, captured in the slogan workfare and not welfare, less government, privatization of public services, new public management for cost cutting, all these kind of instruments and measures that led and that spearheaded the erosion of welfare entitlements that we have since experienced. We had in countries like Germany, the chancellor of a social democratic party introducing reforms that emphasized the activation of welfare recipients rather than their entitlements. We had globalization and the reduction of import taxes through the various international agreements, the Washington Accord, as it was called, that facilitated the exchange of goods and of services worldwide, but leading therefore to a race to the bottom, as it's often called, a incentive to cut production costs, to save on social expenditure in taxation, and therefore unemployment in countries with good welfare insurance systems resulted increasingly from that. International competition under unequal workers' rights conditions forces the reduction of welfare benefit structures worldwide. And we see since the phenomenon of the so-called working poor, with job insecurity and less benefits attached to working. What were the consequences of that for social work? And I think this highlights again that social work is not a profession that, as it were, can just look at its methodology, that can look at personal relationships between the professional and the user of social services. But it is deeply embedded in social policies. The challenges arising from the erosion of the welfare consensus mean for me that belonging has now increasingly become conditional, and that is in contrast with what we understand as social rights, which mean unconditional entitlements to a basic form of existence. People's entitlements are being questioned rather than being affirmed, and social workers come under pressure to, as it were, represent that shift. And therefore, the one-sided emphasis on individualism, on the principle of activation, on obligations, pose this fundamental challenge to the mandate and to the methodology of social work. And social workers have been resisting that very vigorously in some instances. But I think if we just look at students' attitudes to issues like poverty, for instance, there are many studies that underline how students come to courses already socialized into thinking that issues like poverty are individual issues, are individual failings, rather than a matter of structural weaknesses in society. And that means social work is at risk of becoming polarized between, on the one hand, becoming a private transaction, such as therapy is in many instances a private transaction, or of being used as an instrument for the controlling state policies through, for instance, that devious, I think, reference to the principle of activation. And all that is, I think, encapsulated in that hideous distinction that characterized early charity work, where social work, early social work forms, but now again are being used as distinguishing between the deserving and the undeserving clients. And the undeserving are left to their own devices, and we only cream off the deserving cases and give them attention. Therefore, social work is embedded and always has to take account of the social policy context in which it operates. And I very gratefully look at the international achievements by the founding organizations of this conference that have formulated the global agenda of social work, which is a turning point, and it is a shining light for the orientation that social workers have to maintain in the face of this crisis. If we just look at the European Union responses to the crisis of 2008, it had meant increasing the suffering of people. If you just look at the country like Greece, but in many other countries, food banks, handouts to people who live in poverty have increased since, whilst all the efforts of the international community were directed on saving banks through giving them subsidies, but letting the states high and dry with regards to their social programs. And the result of that is, as you can see there from these statistics, for instance, children at risk of poverty is in some cases at extremely high levels, 35% for the indigenous children and up to 50% for children with a migration background. This is a serious indictment of the failures of social protection to our most vulnerable members of society, our children. And so we end in the COVID crisis, and the COVID crisis as an extreme manifestation of the isolation that we are threatened by if we do not attend to the social integration of society. We see at the same time signs of very, very creative and very courageous solidarity You probably have seen pictures of Italians singing at 6 o'clock in the evening in the first wave of the pandemic from the balconies, but also volunteers and professionals putting their own lives at risk to express solidarity under these circumstances. The political reactions to the corona crisis, all of a sudden, the state is, what we can say, back in an enormous turnaround, even in the most neoliberal states like the United Kingdom, where money was being made available to public services and particularly to hospitals. Hospitals were built within weeks. When years and years, the cuts in public services and in health services have been on the political agenda. But does it really mean a reversal of neoliberal principles? We have to ask ourselves. This mobilization of massive public resources, this declaring health and care staff at the front line suddenly as heroes and praising them without necessarily giving them more pay and better working conditions. That is also a sign to be observed very closely. The reliance on science and experts sometimes forms a kind of a smokescreen behind which politicians hide with their own responsibilities and then jump up again and make decisions without any long-term considerations. But most of all, I'm very concerned about this growing polarization between care and control. The measures of lockdown are being seen by many people as an infringement of their personal freedom. And that polarization again means that we have not realized that control and care need to go together. Just to show how different the reaction of the European Union is in the current crisis, when a total of 4.2 trillion euros is being made available for social and health initiatives, economic help, of course, as well in that crisis. An enormous turnaround of previous policies, but we have to see whether they will be carried on. The implications of this crisis for social work is for me that the full implications of the crisis have not been grasped at the public level. And they bring us back to the foundation situation of where social work started in various national contexts. Both in the social policy implications that we have to think through and in our methodology, corona crisis forces us to go back to basics. We can do that through historical reflections, but we have to be aware not to repeat and to copy, but to draw conclusions from a critical analysis of the historical developments. We have to go back to core values and principles through autonomous, research-based, participative forms of professionalism, and therefore, again, enabling autonomy and equality as a combined concern. Relationship building, therefore, as is the topic of this whole series of reflections that you have initiated with this conference, means is an expression not just of something methodological, something interpersonal, but relationship building and bonding is one, or it's the key competence that is required in social work and needs therefore to be practiced in a very specific form. And I just want to highlight what for me practicing relationships from a social work perspective and with the competence of social workers means. It means, first of all, basing change processes on genuine participation rather than just on symbolic or on gestures of participation between the professional and the service user. and not using prescriptions and just asking, well, do you agree with that prescription, and counting that as participation, then informed consent is not enough to bridge that gap. Secondly, we have to recognize the multiple dimensions of personal problems. We as social workers are often, and social work educators are often being accused of not knowing what our own subject, our own discipline is. We sort of borrow from psychology and sociology, economics, political science, and so on. That is our strength, not that we borrow, that integrate knowledge from all those different scientific areas in order to apply them in an integrated and a comprehensive way, and express the linked dimensions of relationships. Relationships are not just emotional factors. Relationships touch everything from emotions to rights and legal arrangements and contracts. Thirdly, tracing and shaping the corresponding facets of social belonging through skilled professional relationships, as I've indicated, and we have to introduce that into our competence training in social work courses. But we also have to take notice of the gaps in social rights in various social and political contexts, and analyze not just in terms of academic analysis, but in terms of being attentive to the effects of lacking social rights in various practice contexts, and picking up these observations to make out of that our interventions, our lobbying for conditions, for better conditions of justice and equality. And finally, promoting as social work educators a continuous educational process of creating learning opportunities in which the skills of critical reflexivity, of a systemic analysis and planning of the conditions under which our service users live and under which we practice, as well as effective political action for carrying out these complex tasks, because after all, social work is a highly complex undertaking. And I think all the difficulties that we are encountering at the moment can serve as incentives for deepening and grasping the nature of our type of professionalism. And with that, I look forward to having a discussion, perhaps now in the remaining time, but also in the various seminars that lie ahead of us, because this is really an opportunity of reaffirming our collective global commitment to the social values that have always inspired our profession. With that, thank you very much, and I hand over to the chair again.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lorenz, for a very, very thought-provoking discussions which you could initiate. I think it's when you say, ensuring unconditional entitlements, and that's a crux of, probably what we need to focus on much more on. Unconditional entitlements is something which we need to ensure. People in distress, people on the margins, which Dr. Su was also mentioning about, when we was talking about inequality. And, social workers are moving beyond the private transactions and being a part of the instrument of the controlling state functions and policies. I think there are a lot of things to be thought through in this. Very, very loaded, very, very interesting, ideas which you have brought in. Now it's open for some Q&A. We have some 15 minutes, maybe 13 minutes we have to take up some questions. If anybody wants to post some questions or ask directly. Anybody want to go or post questions?
Yes. I posted. Thank you so much, Walter. Excellent to remind us at history also the lived history and what might live ahead of us, and all the worries that we do share. And I want you to maybe to say some words about the universal basic income ideas as a philosophy, but also as action.
Okay. Perhaps we collect a few observations and questions.
Yes, yes. If there are any more questions.
Yes, can I?
Yes, Teresa. Yes, please.
Yes, I'm Teresa. I'm from the European Association of School of Social Work. Well, I join Daria and I think all the others in thanking you very much for your concise but very, very strong lecture. And in all the things that you have said, I would like to deep a little bit more the role, the last sentence that you gave us regarding the role of educators and what you think regarding the specific risk that we run as social work educators in this challenge between, well, the challenge linked to the isolation, but also to the bounds that we have in the universities. So this is, I would like to focus on this specifically. That is very interesting for me. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, any more? Two more questions we can take. Yeah. If anybody is having. All right. Okay. Maybe
I start off with those two questions.
Lorenz, can I just add on one more question as a participant?
Okay.
You were talking about the care and control functions being played, and also you talked about investment in welfare. That's a very interesting proposition. Quite often we talk about social expenditure and social sector expenditure, and you talk about investment in welfare. So how do you relate between the investment in welfare, idea of investment in welfare, and the care and control functions which social workers are playing? Thank you.
Okay.
Shahjahan, can I just add? Sorry, Walter.
Yes,
I'm sorry. I'm Vimla Nadkarni.
Yes.
We had met earlier. I wanted to just add to what Shahjahan said, is that the state is taking control of social work in many countries. So what would you suggest? How do we keep away? I mean, we work with the state and at the same time, we don't work with the state because we want to work with the people, okay, to ensure their basic social and human rights or environmental, whatever rights, economic rights. But we are torn between the two and we are often used as handmaidens of the state. So what is your thinking in relation to that?
Okay, so you could go, Lorenz. Yeah.
Yes, we are in the middle of the core issues. Thank you very much for all those questions. I think, Daria, the idea of universal basic income highlights this right to entitlements. And as you probably know, there have been some experiments with that, particularly in Finland, where unconditional basic income was given to people regardless of whether they were unemployed or seeking employment. And it has been proven to be an incentive to look for work rather than what the classical economists, or at least the neoliberal economists, always warn us, that it would be a disincentive to work. People want to work, people want to be active, and they need to be facilitated in being active. But I think it all depends in what kind of a wider political context it is being offered and is being discussed. It is not a magic wand that you can just say, well, now we change over to basic income. Because as we can see, for instance, in the changeover from material help or from service help, for instance, in the care field, if you just give people money to buy care for themselves, you again open up a whole competitive commercial market that leaves people vulnerable to being exploited through their ability to have money. And the old contradictions of for-profit and not-for-profit services can re-emerge. So basic income, yes, but embedded in a well-thought-through, wider social policy initiative. And for Teresa's questions about the task that lies ahead for social work educators, I'm obviously very worried about the games that are being played with our academic colleagues in the climate of, again, academic competition, in the ranking obsession that we can see, publishing for the sake of publishing rather than looking at the quality and on the impact for our students and for our practitioners of what we are publishing. And I think we have to make our voice very strongly heard within the academic context, that new and appropriate criteria for assessing our priorities and our concepts of quality are being heard. And I take great courage that many leading universities, I've just been involved in an evaluation exercise at the University of Lund in Sweden, one of the leading universities. They have forbidden us as evaluators to use quantitative criteria for the evaluation of their research. So there is hope that a change in that direction takes place. But we have to make our voice heard strongly, and not just in an apologetic way of saying, well, we try to be as good as the computer scientists who have publications day and night only concerned. We have to maintain on our values. And for Shayahan's and Vitan's questions about the state and our involvement in care and control, there is a political side to that. And I think we have to pay close attention to the political dangers of being instrumentalized. But I think we also have to be very clear that caring is not just being nice to people. Caring always involves also an element of taking authority, and it therefore requires legitimizing that authority and not just taking that authority. Authoritarian authority is precisely when that authority simply relies on legislation and on some sort of a power structure that you carry with you. We as social workers have to, in the act of meeting people, we have to establish and we have to, as it were, embody authority, which then allows us, for instance, to intervene and take children into care when they're in danger, of protecting people from their own behavior at times. And I think that link, again, between our professional insight at the interpersonal level needs to be related to our stand that we take at the political level. I remember from the times of my social work training in the 1970s, the radical social work presented itself under the motto, in and against the state. So not to criticize the state from the outside, but to get into the dirty business of being a public employee and showing your critical distance in those circumstances. And I would sum that up as being almost a critical friend to the public administration, but not to abandon our responsibility in the public context, because otherwise we are into privatization and we are into unnecessary conflicts with what is being demonstrated so evidently in the corona crisis, that we need collective responses that are sanctioned by politics, that are sanctioned by resources, that are based on rights rather than on privilege or on arbitrary decisions.
Thank you, Professor Lorenz. Very, very interesting explanations which you could give. There is a question in the chat box. It appeared to be very simple, but it's a very, very interesting question. Do you see any distinctive division of role of social workers in the public and private sector? I don't think it's just a very simple question of seeing the difference between the two. It's also about how social work is being promoted within the state sector as well as in the private sector. So do you see any kind of distinctive roles, particularly in the COVID crisis?
I mean, even before the crisis, I sometimes get the impression that we are again operating with that distinction between retaining more of the controlling functions of social work within the public sector and decentralizing and indeed in contracting out the caring sections where it is a matter of being nice to people, particularly in areas like disability, for instance, or in certain areas of psychotherapy, family therapy, and so on. And I think, again, that is creates a dangerous illusion, as if the private sector, as it were, was automatically nearer to people, and the public sector was immediately, as it were, on the other side, and almost the enemy and a threat to people. So we have to watch the organizational arrangements. I mean, we can see that many charitable non-for-profit organizations now have to tender for funding for limited periods and compete with sometimes for-profit organizations. And that has a severe impact on the way services and social work services are being delivered, sometimes to targets that ensure the profitability or at least the continuity of the service, which means a creaming off of, if you like, the easier cases and leaving again, if we can say that, the worst cases to fall through the net of the private services and being then picked up by public services, including the prisons and not the social services.
Thank you. Professor Srilata has a question. She has raised it. Yeah, please go ahead. This could be the last, maybe, unless there is some pressing questions. We are almost reaching the final few minutes of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lorenz, for your inspiring and thought-provoking presentation. You mentioned about isolation because of COVID, but to my mind, there is already existing isolation in the form of exclusion and stigma, and COVID has only heightened this isolation, exclusion, and stigma. So how do we as social workers deal with this squarely in our curriculum so that we contribute to interrupting this divide rather than deepening the chasm of isolation?
Yes, I very much agree with your observation that in a way why people have consented to the public measures of social distancing relatively easily is because I think we have already become used to social distancing in many forms. People live in ghettos, people live in separate worlds, people live in gated communities where they have their private security and enjoy their wealth untroubled by the ones in the downtown ghettos. The way we should pick that up, I think, in education is by looking how closeness and how immediacy can be expressed now under these restrictions of, for instance, not just abandoning people in old people's homes and saying, well, they just have to sit 2 or 3 months in complete isolation. There are ways of getting through the barrier. And I think we can invite our students to look at their concrete life experiences, start with their own social needs of what they would like to do and how they can themselves overcome the limitations in order to build the professional competences on top of those experiences.
There are 2 more hands up, Chinchai and Abitase. So Chinchai, go first.
Yes, thank you. I'm Chin Chai from SCMU Regional President, Southeast Asia and Pacific. According to your questions, Sahajan, can you clarify more how to financial investment for unconditional measure in this situation? Thank you.
Okay. Yes, I mean, this is ultimately the crucial social policy question. And I think going back to human rights and the whole period in which international organizations like the United Nations were spending enormous efforts in formulating basic human rights, we must go back to those kind of principles, but combine them with the insights that we have since gained, that it is not enough to just have a declaration, but that the declaration has to be implemented. The declaration's application and implementation has to be monitored. And I think not enough effort is being made in a monitoring system that obliges the signatory countries to those international agreements to actually come up with the concretization of those commitments that have been made. And only in that interplay between politics and economics can we achieve a kind of a global level where human rights and social rights are not just an ideal aspiration, but a lived reality for people. So I think it is a matter of, again, bringing the microstructure of personal interactions into direct contact with the macrostructure of political and economic processes.
Okay, the last question, Abhi. Yes.
Thanks, Lorenz, for this really inspiring presentation, Walter. It's been long that we see each other, and then I'm very happy to see you. My question is, your presentation, I mean, drove from the history of, I mean, the Western or the East, whatever. I mean, the West, it depends from who. West is for who. I mean, I'm now sitting here in Africa, and the West for us is everybody. I mean, being the West or the East. But my question is, when you're speaking about the decline of the welfare state, but in many parts of the world, there has not been welfare states, and it's only emerging. How do you see social workers, the profession of social work, within that context where there is no basically welfare state, where there's no provision of welfare state, and social workers are isolated? Often it's a work of grouping. They have to innovate. How do we have to see this? I mean, what will be the role of social workers into mobilizing community, working with community, and having a different form of social work? Because there is no, in many countries, there is no any social profession, and to say it's only, in some countries, only emerging, even social work education by itself. And how do you see this, Walter? Thank you.
Thank you, Abe. Yes, it's always good to make contact again across countries and all the divides that we are living. My interest in history and the history of welfare and the history of social work has never been, or I discovered through my interest, that it is not and can never be a matter of idealizing a particular period and say this was the golden age of the welfare state, let's go back to that state. On the contrary, I think we need to look at history and at histories in the plural in order to investigate what different efforts people under different conditions made in order to strengthen social solidarity. And were able to make contacts with countries and colleagues across the Iron Curtain, that it wasn't true that social work didn't exist there. There were many forms of social work, but they were not called social work. And we have to build on that rather than saying, now forget all about your past. take our model and implement that. And I have very little contact with the countries that you represent, Abby, but I would imagine that the same basic approach is the only viable approach to building welfare conditions that are, on the one hand, specific to the tradition and to the culture of a particular context, but at the same time make contacts and take account of universal standards as well. And I think that's the opportunity that we have of bringing those considerations and those historical insights, how to differentiate and how to universalize at the same time our principles and our practices, bringing them together. And I, again, laud the efforts that the international organizations have made in, for instance, coming up with the global standards and the implementation monitoring system that arises from that. That should give each participating country and each context the opportunity to come up with their own models, but with the benefit of experiences from across the divides.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lorenz, for all your thoughts and clarifications. I wish to thank each and everyone for such a very, very engaged session which we had. All your questions and all your engagements made the session very, very interesting.